Well, it seems that the BBC have really outdone themselves this time, because it appears that they're now prioritising hurting terrorists' feelings over telling the truth. But just what am I going on about then? Well, apparently the big bosses have made a bit of a fuss over how they describe Hamas, and that is because a presenter on their news channel, BBC News, which in my opinion is anything but, got into a bit of hot water, shall we say, by calling Hamas a terror group, which from what I'm aware they are, aren't they? During a broadcast, this was on June the 15th. And a viewer unfortunately wasn't too happy about that and complained that this went against the BBC's editorial policy. Remember, this is just one viewer, and of course it seems the BBC caved in about this. And apparently the BBC only uses terms like terror group when they're officially labelled as such by others, to keep things accurate and impartial. But the BBC's Executive Complaints Unit, the ECU, decided that the presenter's choice of words wasn't actually quite right for the situation, and his decisions made his way up to the BBC News managers for a good old chat. Well, like to have seen how that went, eh? But this whole thing comes after a lot of back and forth about whether the BBC should actually call Hamas a terrorist group, especially since the government does. So you'd think, wouldn't you, that as apparently they are, from what I've heard, the government's mouthpiece, then they really should follow suit and call Hamas terrorists, shouldn't they? Because like I say, as far as I'm aware, that is what they are. And Danny Cohen, who used to run the BBC television, was rightly ticked off and said that people paying the licence fee probably aren't thrilled about their money going towards defending extremists, and he thinks the BBC is being too stubborn and won't acknowledge Hamas as a terrorist group, especially after the awful events on October the 7th. And Cohen even suggested that the ECU isn't doing its job properly and that the BBC shouldn't be judging its own reporting. Well, at the end of the day, yes, the BBC should be impartial, but when a certain group are labelled as terrorists, then the BBC should be putting truth about what these people are over hurting their feelings, in my opinion. But the BBC, what they all said about it, well, surprisingly, the BBC hasn't commented at all on this yet. But after October the 7th, 2023, former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was clear that the attacks were acts by terrorism by an evil terrorist organisation. I mean, how much clearer do the BBC actually want it? And he mentioned this during a meeting with the Israeli President Isaac Herzog, and Herzog wasn't having it, saying that the BBC's portrayal of Hamas wasn't accurate. But then in May 2024, when there were reports about a British-Israeli hostage's death, former Foreign Secretary Lord David Cameron was pretty harsh on the BBC for not branding Hamas as terrorists. Meanwhile, veteran journalist John Simpson tried to clear things up in an opinion piece on the BBC in October 2023, and he pointed out that some big news organisations have similar policies, but the BBC gets more flack due to critics in politics and the press. But BBC, remember, is what we all pay the licence fee. Well, I personally don't pay it because I don't watch the BBC or anything live, but a lot of people do pay the TV licence, and therefore, if they want to watch live TV or the BBC, they unfortunately don't have a choice not to pay it. So the BBC really should be describing them as terrorists if that is what they clearly are. Especially, of course, as the government has already said they are, and the BBC, like I said, are the government's mouthpiece, from what a lot of people have told me. Simpson explained that while the BBC reports on governments labelling Hamas as terrorist organisation, this includes interviews where people use the term they prefer to stay neutral. Well, there's no surprise there, is there? Their goal is to present the facts. Well, you bloody could have fooled me. I don't know about you, but in my own opinion, I wouldn't exactly call the BBC factual at all. In quite a lot of cases, that is. But apparently their goal is to present the facts and let the audience decide for themselves. And I personally don't know about you, but I'd be pretty interested to see what their managing director or director general, I think he is, Tim Davie, would have to say on this matter. And the sooner he says something, the better, because I think, if anything, this could cause a massive boycott with a lot of people cancelling their TV licence. Well, in that case, actually, maybe it's best that he doesn't say something.